All right, so today we're going to continue our discussion of new imperialism. So, first things first, we're going to look at the causes and effects of European colonization in Asia, and then we're going to talk about responses to imperialism. So, we're going to look at kind of generally how these colonized places responded to imperialism, and then we'll look at some specific case studies. All right. So Asia. So again, power players, as in Africa, the British are really the first on the scene. They are the most successful, right? Kind of by the way, the nickname for the British Empire during this time is like the empire on which the sun never sets because they are literally everywhere. So through the middle of the 19th century, as we know, the British East India Company continued to exercise indirect control of India. We've talked about that a few times in the past. But during this time period, the British cracked down on India. So after a revolt by Indian troops called sepoys in 1857, the British extended direct control. So we go from kind of like this economic imperialism where this company is sort of overseeing the country. Now we've got the actual British government controlling India, so much tighter control. And we'll talk about how India responds to that in a little bit. Now, interestingly enough, a power player we haven't really talked about yet because they didn't really play a role in Africa is Russia. So Russia is also expanding its colonial holdings in Asia. This makes a little bit more sense. A lot easier for them to get to Asia than it is for them to get to Africa. Just looking at the geography. So actually, Russia's been in on this game for quite a while. So since the 1600s, Russia, so kind of Russia proper, right? That area around like St. Petersburg and Moscow, so in the west, right? But they have slowly been expanding eastward into Siberia. Now, this was really mainly motivated by economic motives. There were all these sort of wealthy Russian traders who wanted access to furs in Siberia and other natural resources. So they just kept going further and further east in pursuit of that. And the Russian government was like, sure, take all this territory, go for it. Russia also moved south into Central Asia. And that was because, kind of like we mentioned, the Ottoman Empire is not doing so well. They're kind of crumbling. So just like Russia during the Crimean War saw the Dardanelles Strait and was like, ooh, I'll take that. They've been doing the same thing in Central Asia. They're like, Kazakhstan, I'll take that. So basically, yeah, they're picking up pieces that the Ottoman Empire is no longer able to control. This actually really upsets the British because they don't like anyone having territory that they don't have. So the British actually stop Russian expansion further south into the Middle East. They say, hey, that's ours. So eventually the Russians kind of refocus their attention further east and they attempt to colonize Korea. But they were not successful. They are actually defeated by a new growing imperial power who's not even European, and that is Japan, who we will talk about later in this lecture. All right. So France was also kind of a power player in Asia, not quite to the same degree as Britain or Russia. But again, who are they competing with? Britain. So France and Britain compete for control of Southeast Asia. The British eventually colonized Burma or Myanmar, whichever you call it, as well as Malaysia. And then France kind of got most of the rest of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Thailand. Britain and France decided to leave that as a quote unquote like buffer state between British and French colonial holdings because I guess they need like a fire break there. Not really sure. Yeah. Okay. By the way, just as a very, very random aside, some sort of evidence of sort of French colonization here is if you've ever had Vietnamese food, there's some French influence. So just kind of a little interesting side note there. Maybe that will help you remember. All right, so now let's talk about China, which is really the big country that is, which is interesting enough. It's kind of like, it is imperialized in kind of a unique way as well. Let's sort of say that. So, sort of like in the middle of the 19th century, we've got this dynasty in China that's been ruling for quite some time called the Manchu dynasty. But they are not doing so well. It's kind of like the situation with the Ottoman Empire. This formerly huge, powerful empire has kind of fallen into decline, and they're not really able to manage their empire. And Europeans see that, and they're like, how can we use this as a way to gain power and control? So European countries start to try to intrude on China, but kind of like what happened in Africa, this starts to create some tensions between European states. So how does this work? Well, again, kind of starts with Britain, as per usual. So Britain gets to China first and colonizes Hong Kong. France, Germany, and Russia see what Britain is doing. They're like, hey, they're beating us to the punch again. And then what's interesting about this as well is now we are starting to see some non-European powers get involved in colonization. So the United States and Japan also start looking at China and they're like, hey, how about we get a piece of that? So kind of like what happened in Africa. Again, this kind of threatens the balance of power. We're about to see all these European countries go to war for control of China. So kind of again, like what happened in Africa, they all decide, hey, maybe war's not in our best interest right now. So why don't we sit down and let's divide up China so we don't have to fight over it. But what's different about this is, well, first of all, actually, Germany does not lead it this time like they did in Africa. And also, they don't extend direct control over China because at this point, the Manchu dynasty hasn't fully collapsed. They're still there, right? But they're not powerful enough to keep European countries they're powerful enough to keep European countries from establishing direct control over parts of China, but they aren't really powerful enough to keep them out completely. So what these European countries and the United States and Japan do is they establish what's called spheres of influence. They say like, hey, like this part is like, it's kind of ours. We're just going to have influence here. Everybody else stay out. So that's what they end up doing. And this actually, so we mentioned last time that Germany Germany did lead the negotiations over Africa at the Berlin Conference. This time it's actually the United States, interestingly enough, picking up more influence in the world. They negotiated this thing called the open door policy with Europe and Japan, which each country would agree not to restrict the other's access to Chinese trades. They say, okay, well, this is my area, it's my sphere of influence, but I still get to trade with all the other places in China, right? So it's kind of Chinese imperialism is a little bit more economic imperialism in contrast to what's going on in Africa, which is kind of like more direct political imperialism. So that's the difference there. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some responses to imperialism. So how did all these countries that were being colonized, how did they react to that? So there's two kinds of practice. There's sort of two kinds of general responses here. We've got on the one hand modernizers, and on the other hand we've got traditionalists. So who are the modernizers? So the modernizers believe that they could resist colonialism by adopting Western practices. So for example, industrialization was a really big one. So these countries are like, well, if we industrialize, if we build some railroads, we build some factories, we build up our armies, then we'll be able to kind of face Europe as equals. We'll beat them at their own game. And Japan is really the best example of this. So they see what's happening actually in the rest of Asia, and they're like, well, hey, we're on an island pretty far east. The Europeans are going to come for us eventually. So what should we do? Let's catch up to them before they beat us. So they industrialize really quickly. We'll talk about them and sort of how this worked a little bit later on. And they kind of jump on the offense, and they, as we mentioned, right, they're one of the big power players in China. So they start to get in on the imperial game as well, kind of before becoming imperial subjects themselves. So if you can't beat them, join them. In contrast to these modernizers are the traditionalists. So what these people did was like, well, we need to embrace what makes our countries great, what makes them unique and special. We can't try and beat Europe at their own game. So we'll look inwards and be like, okay, well, what strengths do we have that are different? And let's embrace that. Egypt is a really good example of this. So anti-colonialists in Egypt, essentially what they did is like our kind of strength in contrast to Europe is Islam. And what they did is they used Islam as this means of uniting people, not just in Egypt, but all across North Africa and the Middle East against their colonial overlords. And they use this as kind of like the foundation of this anti-colonial independence movement, which will become successful, not this unit, but a little bit later on. But it is really important to say, so we've got these modernizers, we've got these traditionalists. Most people borrowed practices from both. They say like, well, why don't we sort of change this and improve this or make this more like Europe? Why don't we sort of embrace this part of what we're doing? So they took sort of this combined approach. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look specifically at some different regions, and we'll take a look at how they sort of combined elements of that modernizing approach and that traditional approach to resist European colonization. So let's start with Africa. So some middle-class Africans, actually, what they decided to do is they went and they studied in Europe, and they obtained sort of like this kind of Western-style liberal European education, and they were exposed to all those isms that we've been talking about for a pretty long time, like liberalism, like nationalism, right? And what they did is they noticed like this contradiction. They're like, so they went to Europe, they studied abroad basically, and they learn about all this stuff about the brotherhood of man and equality and equal rights and all of that. And then they're learning about all these high-minded ideals, but at the same time, they're aware of colonization in their home country. They face pretty significant discrimination and racism from Europeans. And they're like, hey, what gives, right? You're sitting out here preaching equality. You're having all these revolutions for it. And then what do we get? Absolutely nothing, right? You treat us like second-class human beings. So they recognize that contradiction. So what they did is they went back home. They finished their studies and went home, and they started to use these ideas and that sort of sense of anger to organize political movements calling for independence. So this trend was really common in Africa, but it wasn't unique to Africa. It actually happened in Asia and other places as well. For my first examples from the Caribbean here, so I'm getting ahead of myself. So there was this really famous philosopher named Frantz Fanon. He's actually from the 20th century, so a little bit later, but he was from Martinique, so in the Caribbean. Same thing, he actually studied psychiatry. And he's like, geez, you think us, people in the Caribbean have mental health issues. Geez, I wonder why that is. I wonder if it's because we're being treated like second-class citizens. And so he used that as kind of like the foundation of his philosophy. And then if you're familiar at all with the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese revolutionary, the communist one, Ho Chi Minh, he actually studied in France. And he, interestingly enough, again, he read all this liberal philosophy and he was very much inspired. And he even wrote to the United States and he's like, hey, I read the Declaration of Independence. That's pretty cool. What if we had that in Vietnam? And they were like, you don't get it. So that really galvanized him. All right. So now let's talk about China. So China, interestingly enough, they jump straight to war. They're like, well, why don't we just fight these people and get them out? So in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 and 1901, this group called the Boxers, who were members of this secret society called the Society of Harmonious Fist, which is an amazing name for a secret society, by the way, they just straight up rebelled against foreigners. And they also rebelled against Chinese people they thought were colluding with the foreigners and were quote unquote too European. This did not work out for them. So a joint European and Japanese force crushed the revolt. And this actually, unfortunately for China, this inspired kind of a crackdown on China by Europeans. So what Europeans did is they blamed the Manchu government, so that dynasty that was still there but kind of falling into disrepair. They blamed them for the rebellion. They said, like, you stoked this. And they imposed really harsh penalties, which contributed to the collapse of the Manchu dynasty, eventually really allowing for Europeans to even gain it further foothold than they had before. So kind of backfired there. Kind of similar to what happened in India with the Sepoy Rebellion. So these people in India rose up and then Britain used that as an excuse to crack down and gain greater control. All right, so now we're going to come to Japan, which I alluded to a little bit earlier. They're kind of like the prototypical modernizers who are like, why don't we just beat Europe at its own game and become imperialist powers ourselves so that we don't get taken over? So this happened during this period called the Meiji Restoration, and I'm going to butcher all these names, by the way, which occurred around the turn of the 20th century, so late 1800s, early 1900s, under the auspices of Emperor Mutsuhito. And he looked at Japan and he was like, why don't we send a bunch of people over to Europe? Let's look at how they run their government. Let's look at how they industrialized, and let's bring that knowledge all back to Japan and let's just do what they did. So this is actually, he kind of reminds me in a way of Peter the Great, who did the same thing. He's like, let's just send a bunch of people over to the Germans and see what they're doing, and let's just do that. So that's exactly what Japan did. They're like, let's just take from the Europeans, see what they're doing, get inspired, and do it. And they did. Their efforts were really successful. Their industrial and military strength allowed them to get in on the colonial game. Like Europeans, they colonized Korea and they developed a sphere of influence in China. And then it also actually allowed, it's funny, I compared the Japanese to the Russians earlier, and the Japanese actually end up beating Russia in a war, which is the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. So this really freaked Russia out. They're like, we are this huge European country and we just got beat by this tiny island. But we'll talk about that more later in this unit. All right. Now we're going to talk about responses in India. So as we've seen, right, British economic imperialism, so the British kind of economically imperialized India before they imposed political control. This really limited the growth and development of industry and kept India really poor. But Indians kind of responded, and actually their response was really similar to how Africans responded. So India did have this really small middle class. They sort of, despite that British economic control, and some of these folks went over to Europe and they studied. And again, they kind of became aware of that contradiction between Britain's alleged liberalism and its denial of India's independence and freedom. And the best example of this is someone who you guys probably know, who is Gandhi. He actually studied to become a lawyer in Britain, and then he actually saw not only British imperialism in India, but also in Africa, because he practiced as an attorney in South Africa before he came home to India. So his experience of discrimination in South Africa and in India sort of galvanized, or in Britain really, galvanized him against British imperialism and really inspired him to advocate for India's and eventually lead a successful independence movement in India for independence from Britain. So yeah, by 1919, a lot of Indians were pushing for full independence. They had really had enough.